Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes. Thank you for joining us on today's Real Estate Insight session. My name is Toluwani Akinyemi, and for the next 20 minutes or less, we're going to be looking at land acquisition and compensation in Nigeria to understand what are the principles and processes when government acquires your land and then the process for compensation. So to start with this opening quote that's by Henry Ford that says that anyone who stops learning is old, whether at 20 or 80, and anyone who keeps learning stays young. That's literally the purpose for our Real Estate Insight, so that you can continue learning on matters relating to property and to real estate in general. So let's go right into the study. Now, before we jump into the study in depth, I would like to establish some ground rules of land ownership in Nigeria, just to give us a sort of background or an introduction. The first thing is that land use, land purchase, land acquisition in Nigeria is governed by the Land Use Act of 1978. So matters as relating to land, you want to buy land, sell land, land rentals, is governed by this particular law. And it was brought about because of the disparity between rich and old in terms of land acquisition. So it was looking like land was getting too expensive for people that were not of high social status to buy. And so they brought about this law to balance the equation, and also for government to be able to easily acquire property for overriding public interest or for public use. Because when government wants to acquire property, the individuals who own the land will put such high value on it that it gets very difficult for them to carry out public projects, right? Now, the second thing is that this law vests all land in a state in the governor of that state. So what that simply means is that any land within the boundaries of a state is owned by that state, but it is vested in the person that holds the seat of the governor. So the governor of a state is the actual landowner of that state. Then the third point, when you buy property, what you get is called a certificate of occupancy, not certificate of ownership. And that just gives you access to the property for 99 years. In other words, when you buy property, you're actually renting it from the government. And that's why you pay an annual ground rent every year to the government. So your land ownership, what is land ownership to you, is actually renting property or land from the government. Now, having all of this at the back of our mind, an owner of a property cannot steal his property, and this is the motive being used in land acquisition. Because when you own something originally, it is yours to begin with. So collecting it back from the person is not you stealing the stuff, it is yours to start with. Now let's go into the study. The first thing is that land plays a very important role in the life of humans and in the development of community, but it is a limited resource. So what you have in a particular area, what you have is what you have. You cannot expand it. Of course, there are instances where developers will try to make mends, they try to sandfill, try to look for just avenues to make land available. But what you have is what you have. If you have 600 square meters of land, you cannot stretch it out to make it 1,000. You can only buy more to make it more, right? And now there are certain projects that the government embarks on to make the life of citizens better in a particular area. These are called infrastructures, social amenities like your road, educational systems, schools, hospitals, and the likes. Now, when government wants to carry out such projects in areas that are well developed, what happens is, in most instances, they would have to take privately owned properties because they need the space. But the area is already well developed, there are no lands available, so they'll have to take back from people that already own this land privately because of such projects. That is what is known as land acquisition. So we want to carry out a project, we want to expand the road, we want to build an airport, we want to build general hospitals. If you notice government-owned properties, they're usually very massive in terms of size. Government hospitals, public schools, secondary schools, private public schools, primary and secondary public schools, they are very massive in size. So they usually need a large amount of land for those projects, and that would require them to take the land back from private individuals. So, land acquisition is the process by which the government acquires private land for the purpose of overriding public interest. Now, the term overriding public interest means that they need it for public benefits. They need it for something that would better the life of citizens within a particular community or area. Now, the exercise of this power by the state usually raises issue of insufficient compensation, where people believe that what you are paying me is not enough for the value of my property or the livelihood I have lost. I am using this place to run my business. You're taking it from me. What you're paying me is not enough. Where people feel like their rights have been violated. If you knew you were going to use this place in the first place, why did you come and, why did you allow me to buy the land as at the time I bought it? When I came to perfect my documentation, why didn't you tell me that you'll be using it at some point? Then land valuation, loss of ownership and livelihood of people. It comes about when their land is compulsorily acquired by the government. But it's also important to note that the government, before acquiring these properties, would have carried out what we know as cost-benefit analysis or the environmental impact assessment to determine whether or not this project needs to be carried out in the first place. So what that means is they would have done the maths, the cost of taking this property back from individuals, and the benefit it will give to the citizens in the long run. Is it really worth it? So if we see that we're going to make close to 1,000 people homeless, and the number of people that will be coming back to use this project in the long run, they are not up to it, so they will see that the project is not worth it. Or if they see that the cost in terms of economic loss to the citizens is not equivalent to the gain that will be gotten from that project, then they won't go ahead with it. But if they've done the cost-benefit analysis and they see that it's a lot more beneficial to the citizens if they carry out the project, then they will go ahead with such project. So compensation arises when the government has taken your property for overriding public interest. That means that there are certain instances where government takes over your property or revokes your rights in that property and they would not pay you compensation. In instances where the purpose is not because they want to use it for a public project, you will not be paid compensation. Now, compensation is just putting you in a position as if the land acquisition never happened in the first place. It is paying somebody back for something that they have lost. For example, Mr. A is driving and then Mr. B runs into him from the rear. If it is totally the fault of Mr. B, it is his job to put Mr. A in a position as if his car was never hit in the first place. That's the purpose of compensation. As if the government never ever took your land in the first place. And then the aim is to give the person a compensation that is worth the amount. If I had put my building up for sale in the open market, I was not under any pressure, it wasn't foreclosed, I want to sell my building, how much will I sell it for? That is what the government is expected to pay you. Now, compensation is not paid in certain scenarios. Like I mentioned, if to start with, your property was taken, say, for illegal purposes, probably somebody is using it as a base for a drug dealership, for instance, and then it is collected from you, you won't get paid compensation in that instance. Another instance is, yes, it is used for a public project, but you did not maintain the setback as laid out by the law. When you want to construct your building, if your property is close to the main road, there's an amount of setback you are expected to leave before you start constructing, and it's because of instances like road expansion, right? If you decide to construct from the main road, as you can see here, if the road is to get expanded, in such instance, then the government can come and clear it out and you will not be paid compensation. So before you build, there's an amount of setback you are expected to leave. Some people would respect this setback, right? They would leave it. They would then construct stores and shops in front of it and then rent it out. In such scenario, if the government wants to expand and it gets cleared, you won't get paid compensation for it. Yes, so then another thing is, if you do not have valid proof of ownership, you do not have something that shows you are the legal owner of that land. So statements like, my great-grandfather gave it to his grandfather and it has been our family for generations, you want to ensure that you guys have a valid proof that shows that legally it belongs to the family of so and so, because if it gets acquired by the government for public purpose and you can't show legal proof, then you will not get paid compensation as well. Now let's look at the process for compensation. The first thing is you get a notice. So you're served a notice, they call it being served. You're served a notice. The government wants to use this land for so and so reasons. Mind you, it can also be in an instance where it's like an entire road. I'm sure we've seen it before, where massive construction is going on and several houses get demolished. Each of them will get a notice that the government wants to use their property. It's important you read the notice, ensure that the purpose is because the government wants to use it. If the purpose states otherwise, then there may be no need to file for compensation in the first place. Now, another thing is to note the dates of revocation, the date on that notice, because anything you do on your property after the date the notice is issued, you don't get compensated for it. So say for instance today, 3rd of November, you get your revocation notice, then tomorrow you decide to start painting your property, give it a new facelift and all, you just did that to look good, to feel good, because the government will not compensate you for that improvement you carried out after the date of revocation. The next thing is you need to determine what you need to get compensated for. Now I'd like us to pay attention here. You get compensated for several things on your land. The first thing is the rent paid by the occupier. If you remember at the beginning when we were establishing some ground rules, we stated that you're supposed to pay an annual ground rent to the government as a tenant, the government being the landowner. You get the ground rent back if you've paid it that particular year, and then you get the revocation notice. Yes, they'll pay you the ground rent back. Now any building, if you've constructed on your property, a bungalow, whatever it is, you get paid compensation for that particular building. Now you also get compensation for installations, crops, anything you've done just on your property to show that it is yours. You've farmed on it, you've done anything on it, even if it's a fish farm, right, and you have ponds, they are all calculated and you are paid compensation for it. Some of these things like the buildings, improvement, there's depreciation. So that means if you constructed the property in 2000, it is not the same as though it's in 2024, or if you built it in 2020, it is not the same as if it was built in 2024. So the wear and tear, all of those things will be put into factor when the depreciation is being calculated. However, you do not get paid compensation for the value of your land, because in the first instance the land belongs to the government, it belongs to the state. So it's just like I gave you something, I'm telling you that I want to take it back from you. So you don't get paid compensation for the value of your land. You get paid compensation for any improvement you've carried out on the land, not for the value of the land. Now the next thing is you are required to submit the claims for your compensation, proving that you have your right or interest in the land. For this you need a legal representative, somebody that has knowledge of the law, to help you submit it, that yes, you're actually the owner of the land, this and this and this was what was on the land as of the date you got the notice for revocation. Now the next thing, the government conducts their verification process. Severally, this process that they conduct, they do not even use a valuer, right, to carry it out. They just get somebody they call an appraiser to determine the value of the property, what they think is worth on the open market, to ensure that it's not far-fetched from what you've written initially before you get paid. Now if it's a personal land, of course it comes to you, but if it's a community land, like it's owned by a community, what they do is they either send it to the community's account, or they pay it to the head of the community, or the government can even decide, we're not giving anybody this money, let us use it for something in this community that they did not have before, to better the life of the citizens. So this is the process for compensation. Now let's look at this illustration. Mr. Ajayi purchases a plot of land at a cost of 5 million naira, and after 3 years the same land appreciates to 50 million naira, and then he builds a house worth 2.5 million naira on the land. This probably 10-20 years ago. But where the government seeks to take over such land, the government is expected to pay for the value of the building after depreciation. So in this case, we appreciate Mr. Ajayi's effort in helping us increase the value of the land, but he's not getting paid for the value of the land. He gets paid for his property that is on the land, and then after depreciation, say we allow for a depreciation of 20%, so he gets paid this particular value. That's how compensation is calculated. Now, what are the key takeaways from this study? The first thing is that all land in a state is vested in the governor of that state. It is the governor that has total control over all lands. Then ownership of certificate of occupancy or any other thing that shows your legal interest in the land is a must before we even start talking about compensation. Do you own something that shows you are really the owner of the land? Do you have something to prove that? The compensation does not always cover the land itself, unless you held the land before the 1978 Act was implemented. So if you held land like all those customary land that were held by, the chief, the head of the community, the baale, that would give individuals to use it for farming, and you're supposed to pay a quota of the farm produce as your tax. For such land, yes, there are talks for compensation. But if it is anything that came about after that 1978 act such that you have your C of O and the rest, there is no talk for compensation. Then avoid leaving your land empty or undeveloped. Do something on your land. If you have land in a particular area, try to do something. Try to farm on it, grow something on it. Just avoid leaving it undeveloped. Now, I know we have some questions. You can leave that in the comment section, but we're going to take some questions that I'm sure are probably on our mind. The first question: can I buy land and it will never be acquired by the government? Yes, it is possible that you get a property and the government has no need for it at all. Are there particular lands or areas where government cannot acquire the land for overriding public interest? There is no land government cannot acquire. If they need it for any specific reason, they will take it from you. If you have something worthwhile on it, they will pay you compensation for it. If I have not carried out development on my land, does it mean I will not be compensated? Yes. If what you have is a bare land with a lot of bush and all of those on it, you won't get compensated for it because it belongs to the government. They are just taking it back. Do I get compensated for uncompleted development? Yes. Any improvements, anything you do on your land aside from leaving the land bare is considered an improvement. Fencing is considered an improvement. You get paid compensation for it. What causes the... Okay, if I co-own the land with someone, will I still be paid? Yes. You have valid proof that I own this land with so and so person, you will still get paid. What causes the government to want to acquire my land? They need it for public use. I specifically stated it, they're needed for public use. If for any other reason your property is revoked, say it collapsed and it's because of malpractices during construction, you won't get paid compensation for such property. But if they need it for a public project, then yes, you get paid. But what causes them to acquire if it's needed for public use? How will I know if a place is susceptible to government acquisition before I buy in? You can make findings, but these things are not often cast in stone. Any project can come up at any point. For instance, while I was coming this morning, I was listening to the radio and I found out that there is a sort of construction that is supposed to start at my 2 environs. So they stated that people should start diverting, look for alternative routes. In such instance, you've heard already, and then you still choose to go to my 2 to buy property, and you don't make your findings. You buy in an area where construction will soon start. That's your problem. You should have made adequate findings before you buy it. But then, like I said, it's not always cast in stone. Certain areas may look neglected by the government, but all of a sudden there will be need for it. Now, if you have any further questions, you can drop it in the comment section and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you very much for listening.